Hi, government students. I want to talk about public opinion. In this lecture, I thought it'd be easier to do this in a PowerPoint, just because I have a lot more specific information I want to convey, and I want to make sure you understand it. Because public opinion has taken a beating recently, and I'm here to defend it. All right. So, why is public opinion important? Well, democratic governments rest on the consent of the governed. Well, therefore, major shifts in public opinion should trigger a shift in public policy. Right? If the public at large wants something, or doesn't want something, that should motivate politicians to act and respond to what their citizens want. But frankly, the American public is not well informed. Generally, they're apathetic. So public opinion can be unstable, weak, can be ill-informed, it can be non-existent. No one really cares about the medical device tax. If you ask people what they think about it, they're not going to know, right? So sometimes it's hard to say like, hey, look, the public thinks this about this issue, you should act on it. Well, the public is all like the wind, it changes direction. So politicians don't always respond to public pressure. And this is why public officials have flexibility, right? They don't just respond to the whims of the public at large. The founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, did not think that public opinion was reliable or even a good place for politicians to go for their motivations. So politicians tend to have a lot of flexibility. We don't always hold them accountable when they do something that's against the general opinions of the public. But public opinion is important, right? And that's why there's billions of dollars in terms of companies and organizations that do public opinion polling and research surveys. They do everything from, hey, do people like this cereal? Do people like this TV ad? Do people like this clothing line? To, political public opinion issues. So, can we believe the polls and fake news? Oh, the polls got it wrong. Yes, we can believe the polls. The polls are almost always accurate within a reasonable margin of error, right? But you have to be careful which polls you choose to look at. So many organizations regularly sponsor independent national surveys. That's important. It's got to be national surveys. They have to be independent. The most reliable ones, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, Gallup, Washington Post, Time. Newsweek used to do really, really good public opinion polls. They have stopped doing them since. But if you go back in time and look at old polls, Newsweek is a good place to go. Political candidates also contract with private marketing and opinion research firms to conduct surveys in conjunction with their campaigns. These are called internal polls. Sometimes campaigns will leak them to the press to be like, hey, look, we're winning. Our internal poll says we're up 5 points, even though silly Washington Post and Gallup, they all say we're losing. Internal polls are almost entirely unreliable. Here's a fun little cartoon, right? Never mind what the voters are saying, says the politician. What are the pollsters saying? What does the public think? As if the voters are not the public. So, what makes for a good poll? Well, a good poll depends on a selection of a random sample of people, right? What it means for something to be a random sample is that anyone within the universe of people, so if we're doing a national survey, right, for, let's say, Donald Trump's approval rating, right? Everyone over the age of 18 would have an equal chance of being selected for this poll to be interviewed, all right? Think about it this way. If you have a giant bag of M&Ms, all right, I don't need to empty the whole bag of M&Ms to find out what percentage of the M&Ms are blue, red, brown, yellow, green, etc., right? I can dig my hand into that bag, pull it out, count them, and that would actually get me a reasonable sample of what percentage of M&Ms are blue, green, yellow, red, etc., right? Because I take that hand out of the bag, count them, put them back. If you do it 3-4 times, you will find out that the percentage of green, blue, red, yellow, etc., right, percentage of colors of M&Ms is going to stay relatively stable. All right, if you want to fund the afternoon project with your kids, go do that. Go get a big bag of M&Ms and play that game. I promise you, within just a couple percentages, you'll be right most of the time. Same principle applies to polling the American public. You only need about 1,000 people out of the entire United States population to have a good sample size, right? Provided those people are randomly chosen. Larger the sample, the more accurate the results, because the larger the sample, the more likely you are to get a closer representation to the actual public at large. Small, but the larger the sample, the more costly and time-consuming it becomes. It's getting really difficult to get people to respond to pollsters, right? Your non-response rate is 9 out of 10 now. So to get 1,000 people to respond to a poll, you have to ask 10,000 people. This makes polling very difficult and very tricky. Also makes it harder and harder to get a reasonable random sample of the population, right? Normally, if you randomly poll, if you randomly get 1,000 people to respond, you will have a pretty accurate breakdown of men, women, black, white, Latino, Asian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, etc. You will get a really good breakdown, and I'll show this later on in a really good example poll that was done. So, the accuracy of the results depends upon the randomness and the size of the sample, in addition to the wording of the question. So questions can influence the way people respond. And so pollsters try to be very careful with how they word questions. Leading questions, they're unprofessional, they're produced to result, their goal is to create a favorable result for their side. That's why I said internal polls tend to be non-reliable because they tend to ask bad questions. And then there's something that's known as a sample error. So because you're not polling the entire population, because you're not asking everyone, there's going to be some error in your poll. If you poll 1,000 people, your results should be within plus or minus 3. So if you poll 1,000 people on what they think about Donald Trump's job approval rating, and 39% say they approve, that number, 39%, is going to be within 3 percentage points plus or minus of what the actual population, if you asked everyone in the country what they thought, that's what the actual number would be. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show you an example in a second. But let's see how we frame the question here, right? So here's one question. Do you favor or oppose allowing students and parents to choose a private school to attend at public expense? Boop, boop. 52%. Oppose? 44%. Favor? Let's ask that question a different way. A proposal has been made that will allow parents to send their school-age children to any public, private, or church-related school they choose. For those parents choosing non-public schools, the government would pay for all or part of the tuition. Would you favor or oppose this proposal in your state? 83% favor. It's the exact same issue that's being polled here, but the way it's being asked results in 2 different responses from the public. All right? The first one, obviously, the idea of private school at public expense might scare some people away. But here, right, hey, you can choose any school you want and the government will pay for it. Well, that's a little bit more reasonable, right? Public expense tends to be like a scare quote thing, like, oh, what? Huh? You're going to use tax dollars? There's no mention of public expense or anything, right? Just government will pay tuition. And then, would you favor or oppose this proposal in your state? The wording of the questions matters, right? Here's a fun little cartoon. The last part, the last slide here. Do you favor Gestapo-style tactics to prevent smoking in public? Oh, sure, we could quibble over the wording, right? But the wording does really matter for polls. So let's think about it here, right? Do you believe that waterboarding is torture and that the U.S. has a moral responsibility not to engage in or condone any form of torture? Question is confusing. What's wrong? There are 2 issues that are being presented. Is waterboarding torture and whether the U.S. should engage in it? You might believe yes for one part, no for another. So how do you respond, right? Do you believe abortion should be legal? Well, first off, the question is oversimplified, as many people believe that abortion should be legal under certain circumstances. Rape, incest, always, first trimester, second trimester, not third, it's oversimplified questions are not necessarily better questions. And here's a fun example of a terrible question. Should the Obama administration step back from the rush to create cap-and-trade energy legislation that will cost jobs, harm future economic growth, and impose an estimated $1,761 of new energy tax on American families? Should be pretty obvious what's wrong with this one. It's fishing for an answer, right? The question is biased. So I mentioned margin of error, okay? So if you poll around 1,000 people, you get around 3% margin of error for your response. If you want to get 1%, within 1% of what the population thinks, you've got to get over 9,000 people. That's a lot of time, energy. Most companies shoot for between 600 and 1,000 respondents. So a checklist for an accurate poll. How do you want to know if a poll is accurate? Check if it's a random sample, all right, where the members or the people in the survey randomly selected. Sample size. How many people were polled? So on Facebook the other day, everyone was making a big deal about this study, about like this opinion about gay parents being able to allow to adopt, and it was like 90% disapprove, and the sample size was 20. No, not terrible, okay? Not reliable poll. Sample error, right? The larger the sample size, the smaller the error, right? The more people you ask, the more reliable the poll is. And the question wording. Did the questions possibly influence the results? And reliable respondents. So this is an issue. Sometimes people feel the need to give socially acceptable answers rather than truthful ones. This is a difficult one. This is something pollsters ran into. The last election, people felt it was not socially acceptable to say that they were going to support Donald Trump, so they did not say they were going to do so. So, the rise of polling companies. Gallup was the first. Literary Digest used to do polls. They would do mail-in surveys drawn from telephone and automobile ownership rolls to pick the presidential election winners. But then 1936, Gallup got it right, and Literary Digest got it terribly wrong. The problem with the Literary Digest method of mailing in, mailing out flyers to people who had telephones and cars is that people with telephones and cars in the 1930s were really rich. So they tended to vote Republican, which meant that Literary Digest got it terribly wrong. They said, the respondents said Alf Landon was going to win because rich people liked Alf Landon, the Republican nominee. Gallup got it right through a random sample. Here's the actual vote compared to Gallup. You see polling is incredibly accurate. They do a great job. So there's something called push polls. These polls are often done by campaign workers posing as independent pollsters. They're wording questions such a way to elicit the right response. If you knew Congressman Smith would soon be indicted for child molestation, would you vote for him? Right? Improving education versus raising taxes. Cleaning up the environment versus expanding governmental power. Right? There's fishing for an answer. Here's a final little funny cartoon, right? I forget. Whom did you say wanted you to vote for? Right? So this is a little overview of public opinion, why it matters and why it's important. Yep. See you guys next week.